Okay, thank you so much. You've thanked me for accepting the invitation. It's kind of a no-brainer because it was a big honor. I mean, I was really delighted to get the invitation from the center, which is, I think, excellently conceived and has already done great work. And also, I didn't realize that until I saw the kind of sort of like advertising that it was named after Joseph C. Miller, the late Joseph, great scholar. That made it even. I mean, really made me feel. It was like an honor to have my work taken that seriously. So I'm delighted to be here. I did a little poll with some of my friends about if I should do a PowerPoint, and they said yes, you should do one. So I'll share a screen with you, and there'll also be some audio. So that'll hopefully maybe help you follow along or give you names or dates of people that you might not be aware of otherwise. And for me, I should just say, from the beginning, for me, this is a really personal issue. I'm Muslim myself, and I really got into studying this issue of slavery in Islam because I wanted to understand how I, as a Muslim, should understand this topic. So, and I'm not only Muslim, right? I'm also American. And if you all have been following the news, you've seen how much this debate is a live debate, a living debate in the United States. And in particular, it's probably the most animated aspect of the discussions around slavery and race in America, I think, is what one might call like the moral problem of slavery, or the moral problem of slavery in history. And that's basically how do we think about the moral evil of slavery across space and time? You can see this really clearly in debates over statues, right? So if one of the kind of axiomatic tenets of modern public life is that slavery is an intrinsic evil, right? So slavery is a gross and intrinsic evil. It's evil. It was evil 2,000 years ago. It was evil 1,000 years ago. It was evil 5,000 years ago, right? So this isn't just something that you see kind of popularly held. This is also quite explicitly stated in things like the Durban Declaration from 2001 about reparations for slavery. It's sort of something that people wouldn't want to question. But on the other hand, if slavery is in fact evil throughout space and time, then what do you do about the fact that every major religious and philosophical tradition either defended slavery or considered slavery natural or condoned slavery until essentially at the very earliest, really the 1600s, and some of them well into the 1800s and some of them into the 1900s, right? What do you do if virtually the entirety of the human heritage, in fact, one could say the entirety of human heritage, was complicit or supportive of this evil? If you think about statues, right? I mean, whose statue would you not tear down, right? So everybody's statue, basically, who lived prior to the 1800s or even into the 1800s. So it's the moral element, kind of what I call the moral problem of slavery, that really got me interested in this topic. And so I wanted to talk about how Muslims have discussed this issue. So I want to talk about this question: did pre-modern Muslim scholars consider slavery evil? My first response is not going to make you happy, but then my eventual conclusion, I think, will be more positive. So just a preview of the arc of this talk. Now, the first thing I want to show you is actually a speech by a Muslim professor. So, and I want to preface this. I have a lot of respect for this professor. I have a lot of respect for him as a scholar. I have a lot of respect for him as a Muslim scholar. I love him, and I consider him my teacher. So I'm going to make him kind of an object of study here, not because I have any, not as a criticism, right, but more because I think that he really provides an excellent demonstration of some of the tensions and anxieties and difficulties that Muslims have talking about this issue of slavery. And I think also this isn't really a Muslim problem, right? This is actually a problem that essentially all religious traditions have had, whether they've recognized it or not. And you can see some of the same debates taking place amongst American and British Christians in the late 1700s and the 1800s. And so this is sort of a Muslim version of a very common debate around the moral problem of slavery and religion or philosophy. This is a khutbah. So Professor Khalid Abu Fadl is a professor at University of California in Los Angeles. He's a professor in the law school. He's also he has a PhD in Near Eastern Studies from Princeton and a law degree. And so he also gives khutbahs. He has a kind of a Muslim think tank called the Usuli Institute. And he gives khutbahs or Friday prayer sermons every Friday, I think most Fridays, and he records them. So this is actually from about a year ago, and I'll play it now for you.
I'm never surprised when lawyers are not in search for the ethical thing to do, but are in search of the practical thing to do, because that's how lawyers are trained, and that's how lawyers function. I am surprised, however, by those who are not lawyers, but primarily theologians, and are not weighed down by legal precedent and fail to make the necessary ethical reading of the Quran in order to bring back an unethical situation. Because even the most accommodating medieval scholars in Islam perhaps accommodated slavery as a necessary evil, but they still saw it as an evil. The difference between them and the modern convert scholars that are starting to defend the institution of slavery is that they don't even see the institution of slavery as evil in the first place. They want to make it morally neutral, or simply condemned or non-condemned on the basis of sociological awareness. It's whatever people decide is good, and whatever people decide is bad. But there's nothing inherently moral or immoral. What I'm saying is that even those medieval Muslim jurists who accommodated slavery always understood that slavery, even if it's necessary, and even if they could not abolish it in their day and age, always saw it as an evil. Now, how about let's go back to the Quranic verses.
Okay, that's just a section from Professor Abu Fadl's khutbah, and you could see, very very clearly, the argument he's making. Right, he's making the argument that Muslim scholars, Muslim clerics always understood slavery to be evil, and that the presence of slavery in the Quran, the precedent of the Prophet Muhammad, in Islamic law, Islamic civilization, was simply kind of a necessary acceptance of an evil that could not be done away with, right? Now you can imagine, right, the tension here, and this is exactly the same. Again, as I said, exactly the same debate that Christian abolitionists had with not only Christian defenders of slavery, let's say in the 19th century, but also with Christians who were not necessarily defenders of slavery or didn't necessarily like it, but who were sort of skeptical about some of the arguments being made by abolitionists about the inherent evil of slavery, right? The question posed to abolitionists was very simple, right? If slavery is inherently evil across space and time, why would God ever have allowed it? Right. So why would it ever, even if you're Christian, you say, the New Testament supersedes and replaces the Old Testament and kind of supersedes Old Testament law. If slavery is evil throughout space and time, God would not have allowed it even in the Old Testament. Right. There's a similar question that we have to ask about Islamic scholarship, right? So if Professor Abu Fadl is correct, if Muslim scholars always knew that slavery was evil, how did they explain its existence, its recognition in the Quran, its existence in the life of the Prophet Muhammad, and its acceptability in Islamic law? Professor Abu Fadl's argument is basically that slavery was evil. Muslim scholars knew it. They couldn't do anything about it. And that if you are sort of an ethically sensible person today, you will, and in fact, he would probably argue even in the past, and you read the Quran, you will understand that God does not approve of this, and in fact, that it's just being accepted as an economic necessity. Okay. So the problem is, so in two of Professor Abu Fadl's books, in one of his books and one of his book chapters, he quotes a very famous scholar called the Abdul-Jabbar, right? So he's a scholar from what's called the Mu'tazili school of theology. I mean, he's from the Shafi'i school of law. So he's an interesting figure. He writes a huge book on basically systematic theology and epistemology. And Abu Fadl quotes him as saying that slavery in Islamic law, in Islam it's called riq, right? That riq is qubhun fi dhatihi, right? That it is inherently immoral and evil in and of itself. Now, I've looked through all of Abdul-Jabbar's books, and one of his books is multi-volume, but I've not been, so also Professor Abu Fadl doesn't provide a reference for this. So he says it's in the book, but he doesn't provide a reference for it. I looked through the book as much as I could. I searched in databases and everything, and I have not been able to find this statement allegedly made by Qadi Abdul-Jabbar. What Abdul-Jabbar does say, right, and I have it here in the text for you, including translated in Arabic, is that since God Most High allows it, and by it, namely making use of slaves, and by his commanding that, like his commanding that slavery be allowed, right? We know the goodness, husn, of making such use of them and the harm this causes them. Okay, so what is Abdul-Jabbar saying? So Abdul-Jabbar belongs to a school of theology, the Mu'tazilite school of theology, that believes that human reason, unaided by revelation, human reason alone can realize is something intrinsically morally good or intrinsically morally evil. And so when he says that we know the husn of this thing, the goodness of this thing, he means the inherent morally objective nature of this thing. We know that this thing is morally objectively good. Why? Because God commands it, and because God is just. God cannot command evil, right? So especially for the Mu'tazilite school of theology, God cannot command evil. So the fact that God allows slavery in the Quran as an option for captives that Muslims capture in war means that it cannot be evil. So the reason I bring this up is because not only do I think that I don't know where Professor Abu Fadl is getting this reference, but actually Qadi Abdul-Jabbar says exactly the opposite of what he's saying. He says the fact that God allows this in the Quran means it cannot, Muslim scholars cannot consider it intrinsically evil, because that would be to say that God is commanding or allowing intrinsic evil. Now, I also want to give credit where credit's due. I did not find this quote. This is found by Professor Sherman Jackson, who's a professor, a Muslim professor at University of Southern California. Okay. So let's see here. All right. So in order to understand this question of the moral nature of slavery in Islam, we have to also talk about the question of freedom and slavery in Islam, right? So the Islamic scholarly tradition, it comes out of the Near Eastern tradition, which is, of course, highly influenced by the Roman law tradition, and also just by the kind of pre-Islamic Near Eastern sort of Semitic tradition, where you have really a dichotomy between free and slave. So it's similar as to Roman law, right? You have basically free and slave. There's not multiple categories. There's just these sort of two categories, right? where as opposed to places like Southern India or Southeast Asia, where you might have like much more of a web of different categories of dependence. In the kind of Semitic and Roman world, it's pretty clear. It's very similar to, we also are heirs to this world. So when we talk about free slave distinction, it's pretty clear in those traditions as well. Now, like Roman law, Muslims considered human beings to be free by nature. So if you find a baby, in the street or something, or someone drops a baby on your doorstep and you don't know whose it is, you don't know where it's from, you know what religion it is, the assumption is that it's free. So human beings are born free, right, by nature. And this again is similar to Roman law. Muslims are this is not actually ever specified in the Quran or the precedent of the Prophet, but it's just accepted and acknowledged immediately by Muslims, and it's not challenged. And there's in fact really like a almost theological a commitment behind this. And you can see this from a very famous scholar named Ibn al-Mundhir, who's from Nishapur in northeastern Iran. He dies in 930. He's actually talking about the issue of babies who are found, like kind of foundlings. In Arabic, it's called laqit. And he says, babies that are found are considered to be free. Why? Because, he says, God Most High created Adam and fortified. Now, the word I translate as fortified here is hassanahu. It could mean fortified. It could mean made immune. But as we'll see, I think it should be fortified, not made immune, because actually humans are not immune to losing their freedom. But God Most High created Adam and fortified him against anyone owning him. And the same with Eve, Hawa. And all people come from those two. So therefore, all people are free. So all the children of Adam are free, except those among the offspring of the unbelievers, mushrikeen, or polytheists, who have been taken captive and thus come into the ownership of the Muslims. So this is a very clear and important thing to keep in mind in Islamic law, which is that the only way that someone can lose their freedom is if they are a non-Muslim who lives outside the Muslim state and is then captured by Muslims. So even, let's say, Christians or Jews or Zoroastrians or Yazidis or anybody who's living as a non-Muslim minority within a Muslim state, those people cannot be enslaved. The only people, according to Islamic law, that could be enslaved are non-Muslims who are outside the Islamic State, who are then captured in war and things like that. And so basically the sources for slaves in Islamic civilization are capture or raiding outside of the boundaries of a Muslim state, or more commonly is just buying slaves. So if a Scandinavian merchant comes into Bulgar with 500 Russian peasant slaves, he can sell them to a Muslim slave trader who then takes them and sells them in Baghdad or something like that. Okay, now I mentioned something really important, which is that although human beings are born free by nature, right, they can legally lose that freedom. And this is one of the biggest differences between not only pre-modern Islamic law, but also pre-modern kind of Western Roman law tradition, and modern notions of human rights and human rights law, right? So in modern human rights law, freedom is non-derogable, right? So you cannot, non-derogable, right? You cannot take someone's freedom away unless they've committed a crime. So someone cannot be enslaved. Doesn't matter what happens. No one can be legally enslaved, right? In pre-modern Islamic law, just as in pre-modern Roman and Western law, you can be legally enslaved. And essentially the way that you're legally enslaved is through capture and war. Okay. Now, this presented kind of a problem for Muslim scholars, especially Muslim theologians and Muslim legal theorists, who are sort of theorizing about the nature of mankind, theorizing about what the rights that human beings have are, what's called in Arabic hukuk al-insan, or literally it means human rights, the rights of human beings. Hukuk al-abid, the rights of the servants of God, namely human beings. So they had kind of a problem, which is if human beings are born free, how do you explain the loss of that freedom when they're enslaved? Like, how do you justify that? You could just say, well, you're captured, but well, then Muslims could also be captured and they could be enslaved. And scholars never accepted the legality or the possibility of Muslims being enslaved. So even if a Muslim was captured by, let's say, a Christian in the Mediterranean or something like that, that Muslim might, de facto be a slave to that Christian. But legally speaking, from a Muslim legal perspective, that Muslim was never enslaved. It was impossible for Muslims to actually be legally enslaved according to Islamic law. So how do you understand this conception? How do you kind of theorize this loss of freedom? And the way they did this, and you first start saying this really in the 1000s of the Common Era, is the way that Muslim scholars define slavery. In Islamic law, as I said, slavery is called riq. So riq was defined as a legal handicap, or sometimes a legal weakness. In Arabic, it's ajiz or daf, a legal handicap or weakness that inheres in a person because of unbelief. So the definition of slavery is it's a reduction in legal status that is caused by unbelief, kufr. Now, what's actually really interesting is that in some ways, Muslim scholars engage in this really complex theorization of slavery, but actually the real definition for slavery is quite inductive. It's quite ground up. So being a slave is being not free, right? So a slave is someone who has lost certain legal capacities that a free person has. What are those legal capacities? They're the legal capacities that we see from the Quran and the precedent of the Prophet Muhammad and from the early Muslim community, that slaves can't or don't have to do certain things. So for example, slaves don't have to pay the zakat tax. They don't have to pay the charity tax. Slaves don't have to go on Hajj. For most schools of law in Islamic law, slaves can't be witnesses in court. For most schools of law, slaves can't own property. For most schools of law in Islam, slaves can't inherit property. They can't bequeath property, right? So if you take all these little particulars that we know from the Quran and the precedent of the Prophet Muhammad and the early Muslim community, we know that are the kind of distinctions between free and slave, and you add them together, that collection of handicaps or weaknesses is the definition of slavery. Now, the reason that it's caused by unbelief is because that's the only thing that Muslim scholars could think of to explain why certain people could lose their freedom. It had to be because they were unbelievers, right? That's the only people that can be enslaved legally are non-Muslims who are outside the abode of Islam, who are then captured by Muslims. Okay. Now, this actually presented several real problems. And in these problems, you see the tension and the kind of conflict or the push and pull between different rights and benefit and notions of benefit. So on the one hand, you had the default freedom of human beings. And on the other hand, you had property rights of owners. Right? And these two, in general, you'd see tension between them, but property rights are very strong in Islamic law. Property rights are very strong. So if you have let's say I'm just going to use myself as an example. I'm Muslim. I capture a Christian in steppes of Russia. I bring them back to the abode of Islam. Now they're my slave. And then let's say that person says, hey, Islam is great. I want to become Muslim. Now that person is Muslim. But just because they're Muslim, I don't have to free them. I can free them if I want. In fact, the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet are obsessed with encouraging Muslims to free slaves. Obsessed with encouraging Muslims to free slaves. But I don't have to. So I don't have to free this person, even though they're Muslim. So how do Muslim scholars understand that? They know that because it's clear from the Sunnah or the precedent of the Prophet Muhammad. You're encouraged to free slaves, whether they're believers or unbelievers. You're especially encouraged to free Muslim slaves, but you don't have to. And there's lots of instances in which Muslims don't free slaves, even though they convert to Islam. So how do Muslim scholars explain the fact that now I have a slave who's Muslim, but they're still a slave, even though they're not an unbeliever anymore. So how do we explain their loss of freedom now? And their argument was, well, their slave status is a vestige. It's like a vestigial result of their prior unbelief. So their prior unbelief has this vestigial effect of their currently being a slave. Okay, fine. We'll accept this. But there's an even bigger problem, which is that if a slave woman, let's say, gets married to either another slave man or to a free man, anybody except her master, if she has a child with that husband, let's say she's come to the abode of Islam, she becomes Muslim, she's a very pious Muslim, right? She marries another very pious Muslim slave, or they have a child. That child is born a slave, even though that child never experienced unbelief. So they were never a pagan, they were never a Christian, they were never anything. They were always a Muslim from the moment they were born because their parents were Muslim. So how do we explain their being a slave? And here Muslim legal theorists really had, they're kind of running up against the rocks, so to speak. And so when you look at someone like the Hanafi legal theorist Abdulaziz al-Bukhari, who died in 1330, he talks about this, and he basically says, okay, the child is a slave because this is a command of the divine law, because God says so, and because the ownership right of the owner supersedes the sort of not only the natural right of human beings to freedom, but also the fact that this person is now Muslim and that Muslims can't legally be enslaved. The child is a slave because he was never actually enslaved. He was born into this status. Al-Bukhari offers sort of an analogy. He says, there's certain kinds of land that, if they're owned by a non-Muslim, they get taxed in a certain way. And then even if a Muslim buys the land, the Muslim still has to keep paying that earlier tax. And he kind of uses this as an analogy. But you really, I think it's becoming pretty clear that this theorization is really falling apart. And it's falling apart because Muslim scholars always had a very strong affirmation of property rights and ownership rights. And those ownership rights often trumped, I hate using that term, but trumped other things like inherent human right to freedom. Okay, there's other, I think, aspects of this theorization that show how weak it was. One is what's called the Ahlul Fatra idea. So this Ahlul Fatra means the people who live in times and places of vitiated prophecy. And this is a phrase that really appears in the Quran, not exactly as this in those words, but the notion of Fatra appears in the Quran. And it's explained clearly in the Quran, which is that people are not held accountable for not being Muslim. So God does not punish people for not believing in Islam if they never learned about Islam. So if you live in, Peru in 500 AD, or let's say, Peru in 800 AD, right? So there's no more prophets after the Prophet Muhammad. And you've never heard of prophecy, right? You're not going to be punished by God for not being Muslim because you never heard about Islam. Like, God will judge you independently on the Day of Judgment. Similarly, if you live in Nebraska in the middle of America and all you do is watch Fox News 24 hours a day, you also, according to a lot of Muslim scholars, not going to be judged by God for not being Muslim, because all you've ever seen about Islam is that it's the religion of terror and, people screaming and yelling and, waving black flags and stuff like that, right? So here's the thing. If the only people who can be enslaved legally in Islamic law are non-Muslims outside the abode of Islam, right? So they don't have any contact with Muslims. They probably have no idea what Islam is. If God is not going to punish them for not being Muslim, why do Muslims have a right to enslave them, right? So why does their unbelief, which God basically discounts, why does that become a valid cause for their loss of freedom? And the second problem with this theorization is that there's the tension between there's not a clear line or a clear and consistent relationship between property rights and freedom or the Quran and the Prophet Muhammad's urge to free slaves. So Islamic law, in its root in the Quran and the precedent of the Prophet Muhammad, in its historical development, is obsessed with emancipation. I don't know of any other religious or philosophical tradition prior to the 1800s, really, that is as obsessed with emancipation as the Quran, the precedent of the Prophet Muhammad, and Islamic law is. The rewards you get for freeing slaves, the encouragement you get for freeing slaves, are just, you can't count the number of prophetic reports that encourage this. And the way that Islamic law sets aside other really important legal principles, like, for example, intention in contracts. So when people make an agreement or say something, what they intend is really important. But when it comes to things like, let's say, in the Shafi'i school of law, if I have a slave and I say to my slave, okay, clean up this, and after that you're free to do, go and do whatever you want. The fact that I say you're free, boom, automatically, even if I didn't mean to free that person, the slave becomes free. If you're walking down the street and you kind of bump into somebody and you say, oh, sorry, my good free, in Arabic, you're like my free man, my good man, right? And that happened to be your slave, you accidentally said that to him, boom, that person is free. This is in the Hanbali school of law. So the Islamic law was willing to sort of supersede certain important legal principles, even for the sake of freedom. Here's the problem, right? So slavery is present in the Quran. God can't command something that's evil, therefore slavery cannot be intrinsically evil in Islamic law. Now, slavery is a result of unbelief. Muslims are encouraged to free their slaves, but both that encouragement and the default human right of freedom do not supersede the ownership rights of somebody over their slave. Okay, so let's think about then, how do Muslim scholars conceptualize slavery negatively? And this is a very important point, okay, where I think Professor Abu Fadl would have been completely correct if he said not that Muslim scholars thought slavery was intrinsically evil, but that slavery was intrinsically harmful. And this is very clear. Muslim scholars make this very clear. And this is a quote from a famous Hanbali scholar from Damascus. His name's Ibn Qudama. He's a prolific writer. I can actually show you. You can see this is one of his books. This is a good advantage of Zoom. There you go. How many volumes is that? 14. That's one of his books in Islamic law. And so he writes this when he's talking about why the Prophet Muhammad encourages emancipation so much. And here's his explanation. He says, emancipation is virtuous because it entails freeing a human being inviolable from the harm of slavery. Darar. The word in Arabic is darar. Giving him ownership of himself and the fruits of his labors, making complete his legal standing, and enabling him to act regarding his own person and his labors according to what he chooses. So you see here like a really clear recognition of the harms of slavery. Slaves they can't choose, they can't do whatever they want, they can't do whatever they want with their possessions, they're not complete legal people, right? There you go, very clear understanding. This concept of harm in Islamic law is very, very important. It's extremely, it sort of runs like a lubricant throughout the Islamic legal tradition. It's never really explicitly discussed by the Quran or the Prophet Muhammad. The Prophet doesn't say, let me tell you what the different harms are. But the idea that both by looking at the scripture of Islam and by looking at local custom, you can determine that certain things are harmful or not. And that really affects things like how we should understand marriage, how we should understand contracts, how we should understand, what kind of actions are considered tortious or inflicting wrong on other people. This notion of harm is very, very important in Islamic law. So you see here very clearly this idea that slavery is actually harmful. It's actually harmful. And it's not just Ibn Qudama who says this. For example, Ibn Rushd al-Jid, the grandfather of the famous philosopher Averroes, Ibn Rushd al-Jid, who died in 1126 of the Common Era, He's himself a very, very accomplished jurist who writes, multi-volume works. He talks about slavery is harmful because it takes away people's freedom, takes away people's ability to be to act freely in the world, right, and to enjoy the full rights of other people. And so emancipation returns that right returns that benefit to those people. And another point in the book, which is really interesting in Ibn Qudama's same book, he talks about a case of it's sort of a weird situation, but I'll just use myself as an example again. I have my father is, let's say, divorced, and I want to give him a slave woman so that he can have a companion. And I'm, let's say, rich son. I've made it big in the Baghdad equivalent of tech, Silicon Valley or something. So I give him this slave woman. I'm actually not allowed to do that. Why? According to Ibn Qudama, because I can't give him marry him to the slave woman, right? Because the child born of that relationship would be a slave, because the slave status follows the mother. And Ibn Qudama says that's harmful, that creates harm. And Ibn Qudama is very specific about this, even if my father says, it's okay, I don't care, I cannot give him a slave wife because I am wronging that child. I'm creating a child that has been wronged by having the harm of slavery invested in him from his birth. Okay. Now, one could say, well, Professor Brown, that's really clear. Muslim scholars thought slavery was harmful. One of the major principles of Islamic law is ad-darar yuzal, harm should be removed. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said, a very famous hadith, la darar wa la dirar, there's no harm and no harming, right? So that's very important. So why should Muslim scholars ever allow slavery at all? Again, we have to go back to this notion of balancing harms and benefits. And you see this, it's a very similar situation to the one we talked about with freedom. Freedom is a human being's inborn condition, it's their natural condition, but they can lose that. Freedom is not the most important thing in Islamic law. And you can see this, Ibn Qudama has a great discussion of it, or lots of Muslim scholars, but Ibn Qudama is one of them. Manumission, or freeing your slave, was highly encouraged in Islamic law. You got a great reward from God. But it wasn't good in certain circumstances. In fact, it was not allowed in certain circumstances. In the Maliki school, you see the idea that you shouldn't free your slave if the slave has heavy debts. By the way, the Maliki school is the one school that really allowed slaves to own property. So that's why you're talking about a slave who has debts, right? But you're not allowed to free a slave, and then that slave is in an economic situation where they can't survive on their own. Ibn Qudama says very clearly, it's disliked, it is discouraged to free a slave who would be unable to support themselves, or who would be likely to return to the abode of war, the outside of the Islamic world, and or leave Islam. So let's say they became Muslim. If they were going to go back to the steppes of Russia and go back to their previous religion, it's disliked for you to free them. And if you're sure that they're going to do these things, if you're sure that the slave is going to be a burden on society, if you're sure or substantially sure that if it's a woman, she's going to, let's say, become a prostitute, or a man, he's going to end up stealing to support himself because he doesn't have any other ability to support himself, it's prohibited for you to free them. And finally, I'll just close with this one vignette, or an encounter between two very famous scholars, the founder of the Shafi school of law, Muhammad ibn Idris al-Shafi, and his teacher, who's also a founding figure in the Hanafi school of law, Muhammad bin Hassan al-Shaybani. They have this debate because their two kind of legal methodologies or legal visions have different understandings about rightful ownership and harm. And this debate appears in lots of sources, but this version includes something about slavery, so I want to mention it. So the debate is, if someone has wrongfully appropriated something, do they have to give that back to the original owner, even if it causes harm? And the debate they get in is over a piece of wood. So let's say someone steals a piece of wood, or they take it, they don't even know they're stealing it, but it's not theirs, they take it, and they go and they build their house, and it's sort of, this piece of wood is a basic foundational piece of wood in that house. Then the rightful owner comes along and says, hey, I want my piece of wood back. According to a Shafi, you have to give that piece of wood back, even if it means your whole house is going to fall over. Shaybani says, no. The Prophet said, no harm and no harming. Therefore, if you want, you can yank that piece of wood out and your house can fall down. You give it back to the original owner. But you can also just pay them the value of that wood. And therefore, no harm will be done to you. And Shafi, his response to Shaybani is very interesting. He says, okay, Shaybani, let's imagine a situation. Let's imagine that a man wrongfully appropriates another man's slave woman. So Ahmed, the Muslim, goes and takes this slave woman from another guy and makes her his own. They have kids together. Because he thinks, or everyone thinks, that she's his slave woman, because she's his slave woman, the children are actually free, right? So they're born free. This is a unique feature of Islamic law. And they have 10 children, 10 sons, and they all become very pious. They all memorize the Quran. They all become leaders in the community. They all become judges, Sharia court judges. And then indisputable evidence is given that this woman was actually wrongfully appropriated by this guy, Ahmed, and in fact, her real owner is this other fellow. What should happen? Shaybani here is trapped, right? Because in the case of the wooden plank, he's willing to kind of push back against the original ownership right of that plank owner, that wooden plank owner. But in the case of slave woman, it's so established in Islamic law that a slave woman belongs to, or any slave or a slave woman belongs to her owner, and the children that woman has belong to her owner, that he has to say, well, yeah, those people, those 10 sons, they would actually be enslaved because they were never really free. They were actually slaves. They were actually the property of their owner, of the owner of this woman. And then Shafi says, what's more harmful, taking a plank out of a building or doing this? Because if you have, a slave cannot be a judge, right? A slave cannot be the leader of a community, like the political leader of a community. So in re-enslaving or enslaving these 10 children, you have done measurable, substantial harm to the Muslim community. But Shafi realized Shaybani's unable to sort of prioritize avoiding that harm over the property right of the owner. Okay, I know there's probably, these are controversial issues, and I want to make sure there's plenty of time to ask questions or make comments. So I will now be happy to hear anything you have to say.